Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Today is Veterans Day, and we want to thank everyone who has ever served and the families who have sent them off and waited impatiently for their return. And some didn't return. Today, we want to bring ourselves into a deeper understanding of peace, not the human understanding of peace, but a deeper understanding of peace. Today is a day when we typically thank our veterans for their service, and it has become, I think, in our society, almost a conditioned response. Like somebody sneezes, and we say, "God bless you." Somebody says they were in the service, and somebody else says, "Well, thank you for your service." And I think it's good. I think it's good that we acknowledge and we stop and we thank those who have served. But today I'd like to ask us to consider that perhaps a better way of thanking is by eliminating the need for service, eliminating the need for armies, eliminating the need for war. The title of today's talk is "When the Guns Fell Silent," and I picked that up from a headline that's kind of circulating around on the news stories about Armistice Day. And now news has to be dramatic in order for people to pay attention to it, and the people who write headlines, they know that. They know that. There was a movie we were watching one time about a man who was learning how to be a newspaper reporter in a small fishing village, and the editor was teaching him how to write headlines, and they looked across the bay. Of course, all the fishing boats are anchored out there in the bay, and there's this big dark cloud. And the newspaper editor says to the guy, he says, "Now, what do you see there? Tell me what the headline is." And the guy says, "It might rain." And the editor says, "No, storm threatens the village. That's the headline." And the guy says, "Well, what if it passes?" He says, "Well, then the storm spared the village." See, it had to be dramatic. It had to be something that reached out and grabbed people. And this headline, "When the Guns Fell Silent," is kind of one of those things. And they even had a little audio clip, a simulated audio clip of what it might have sounded like on the battlefields in Europe when the guns went silent on Armistice Day 100 years ago. And as dramatic as that is, as it creates this image of a sigh of relief, you can imagine what it was like for the soldiers who were on the front and who had been exposed to the din of the guns and the blast for years and years, and living in the trenches and living in the mud and the awful conditions. That there was a sigh of relief that it was over. The war to end all wars was over. But we recognize, with the hindsight that is available to us today, that at best it was only a temporary lull. That when the guns went silent, they didn't stay silent forever. Hostilities continued around the world in different ways, in different civil wars, in different struggles, in different strifes. And less than 20 years after the armistice was signed, the war continued. The guns were no longer silent. The very same belligerent nations that were involved in the First World War were now involved in the Second World War. And since then, we have been almost in a constant state of conflict, our country. One thing after another after another. I can't tell you I don't know that we would know, and I can't tell you how many different places our military is currently involved, engaged. Some in active combat roles and some in what might technically be called advisor roles. But as one one veteran said the other day, he had been in Vietnam. He said, you know, there wasn't a whole lot of difference between being an advisor and being a combatant. You know, they were still shooting at you. So we want to examine this concept then of the human concept of peace. This human concept that we get all excited. You know, the guns went silent, and we have parades and we celebrate, and we have to recognize that it's okay to celebrate. It's okay to feel good, but we need to do more. We need to do more than just celebrate. We need to do more than just feel good. We need to do more than just thank people for their service. We need to diligently and consistently bring out peace. Bring out peace. I was listening to a piece on the radio the other day, and it was two brothers who had both gone to Vietnam, served in different branches of the service, and they came home with two totally different views of America's involvement in Vietnam. The one brother started to come to believe that we had no business being there. That the war that we were engaged in was not a good purpose, a moral war that we were in. That it was politically motivated. It was kind of not right. He said that when he got drafted and he went over, he was idealistic and he thought they were fighting to save the world. He says, and then after a while he realized that they weren't fighting to save the world. There was something else going on. And he said the best he could do was stay alive and try to keep his buddies alive until his tour was up and he got home. And he came home and he was very bitter that he felt that the government had lied to him, sent him into combat. And his brother was just the opposite. And they lived together. They came out of the service and they lived together. And his brother was just the opposite. His brother was, my country, right or wrong, and you know, this was a good and noble cause. And they would get it. They were so passionate about their feelings. Now remind you, they were brothers, and they lived together. But they were so passionate about their feelings that they actually would get into fistfights. And the police would have to come and separate them, these two brothers. And the second brother, the one who came back home still thinking that he had been involved in a noble cause, slowly his perception changed. You know, as the Pentagon Papers leaked out and those sorts of things, slowly he came to realize that what he had believed, what he had been told, and what he believed was not necessarily true. And of course the brothers, you know, still brothers, still friends. So the interviewer asked the second brother, he says, what do you think the lesson is? What do you think there's a lesson that we might have learned from that whole experience that we can bring forward to today? And what the man said was just very touching, just moved me, and that's what I want to share today. But I needed to set it up so you have to know where he was coming from. He said, I think the most important thing that we should have learned is that we can separate the war from the soldier, the war from the warrior. He said, when I came home, I was vilified because people at home were so against the war. And I was just a soldier going off to do my duty for my country. He says, and it was personal. It was personal. I was vilified. He says, and we need to be able to recognize that you can still be a patriot, questioning the politicians' motives for sending soldiers off to war. You can still question the politicians without vilifying the soldiers, We can separate them. They're just young people doing their job. And I thought, boy, that's a mouthful. That is a mouthful. You know, it's kind of like the biblical hate the sin but love the sinner kind of thing. Can we separate the two? Can we separate the two? And I think if we look like politically, if we look at the human level, the political level, which is the politics is about power, you know, and about getting our way and things like that. The politicians still want to blur that line. The politicians want to send our young people off to war, and then if somebody asks them, is this a good war, is this a just war, is this the right war, they want to say, well, you shouldn't ask that question, that dishonors the soldiers. And I think if we go back to what this man said, I think we have to go back and say, no, sending them off to war for the wrong reasons, if there are any right reasons, sending them off dishonors them. And there needs to be accountability. So we look at this then, I look at this and say, well, what has happened to us, part of what has happened to us is we as a society, we as a culture, we have learned or we have been conditioned to one way or the other at the human level, and we're going to break away from that in a moment. We're going to go into the spiritual level. But at the human level, we struggle with this concept of, can I love the warrior but hate war? Can I love the warrior but hate the war? And we kind of think, well, we've got to take them in a lump sum, you know. We have to, if we love the warrior, then we have to love the war. We have to glorify the war. All wars then that we send our soldiers off to must be just and noble, because if they're not, then our soldiers aren't just and noble, and we don't want to believe that. And we have to find a way, if we are to move out of this cycle of boom and bust, of the guns go silent and then the guns wake up and then the guns go silent and then the guns wake up, we are going to have to find a way to break out of that. We're going to have to find a way to separate the two. And then the other thing that I think we need to do, moving into the spiritual realm, is to recognize that the conflicts that we're seeing in the world, the armed conflicts that result in war, but don't even have to rise to that level. These are outpicturings of human consciousness. Somebody said that war is an extension of foreign policy. You know, when negotiating and threats and bullying and everything else that politicians do to one another, when that no longer works, then send in the troops. And I would take it a step back further, and I would say that foreign policy is an extension of what we believe, our consciousness. So if we really want to get to the bottom of things, we have to say to ourselves, then, well, why does war exist? I think I might come back and say, has there ever been a time that war did not exist? Or warlike feelings, or the consciousness that believed in war? Has there ever been a time in the recorded history of the human race? Look at the earliest the earliest documents recorded from different cultures, and it's typically about war. It's typically about battles. Even our oldest scriptures, talk about battles, about God having enemies and God sending his people in there to crush his enemies. And this whole almost worship, glorification of war is ingrained in our society. It is ingrained in our culture. If you stop for a minute and just think like about TV and movies and the things that you see, you've got the MPAA rating system, which Hollywood put in place to protect itself against government censors. And the idea is that a group of parents watch a movie and then they decide what age groups it's appropriate for. and then it gets the rating, then G or PG or whatever. And then at the end of the year, the Motion Picture Association sends out a survey to people and say, of all the movies you saw this year, do you agree with their rating? And if 85% of the people say, yeah, I think that was about right, they're happy and they go on. The point to remember is that the ratings that the movies get is based on a group of people looking at that movie and deciding whether or not they think it is acceptable for different age groups. And look at where the war movies tend to fall. You know, we have movies about war that fall into G or PG-13. You know, unless they have a lot of cussing in them, and then suddenly they become R. Or if they have nudity in them, then they become R. So it's okay. It's okay to show people at war killing one another to teenagers. That's okay according to the parental groups that watch the movies. But my goodness, if there's any cussing or if there's any flesh involved, well, then that's not acceptable. What does that say about us? See, what does that say about our society? That we have come to accept conflict as being okay. So we have to stop and ask ourselves then, is what can you and I do? What should we be doing as spiritual beings? What should we be doing in order to reach a lasting armistice, in order to reach a time when the guns go silent once and for all, forever and forever? So we come to recognize then that this idea of war and the necessity of war and of armed conflict and of defending ourselves and of protecting our interests in other places, this is something that is ingrained in the consciousness of the world, ingrained in the consciousness of society. It is ingrained in the consciousness of our society. And if we really want to thank our service members, I'm suggesting that a better way than just saying thank you, as you would if somebody handed you a cup of coffee or a piece of candy, or saying God bless you if somebody sneezed, a better way is working diligently for peace. Excuse me, let me get a drink of water here. And here is where we have to make a distinction between the peace as the world knows it, as human consciousness knows it, and the peace that passes understanding. The peace that passes understanding. See, the peace that the world knows is not the peace that we want. The peace that the world knows at best is a lull, a cessation of hostilities. You know? As Spinoza said, peace is not the absence of war, it is a way of life. A way of life. Now, starting with the cessation of hostilities, starting with the absence of hostilities, that would be a good place at the human level, but that's not enough. That's not enough, because we know what happens is, over time, we forget. Over time, we go right back to where we were. In less than 20 years, World War I morphed into World War II. Some of the same battlefields where the soldiers from World War I are buried, soldiers from World War II are buried and perhaps fought over. They're in the same areas. It just goes on and goes on and goes on in human consciousness. So we want to break that mold. We want to break that cycle. We want to step out of it. So I was thinking of something this morning as these ideas were rolling around in my head. And I want to go back to a ritual that I grew up with when I was a young boy, a church ritual that I grew up with. And I was raised in the Catholic Church. And we would go to Mass on Sunday. The ritual was the Mass. Now, Joseph Campbell, I love his work. He says the ritual is the reenactment of the myth. And in the term myth, he's not talking about a fable or fairy tale or a lie. He's talking about a metaphor that contains our deepest values. And as I was a child growing up, the Mass was the reenactment of the Last Supper. And in a way, you can think about it, or I would think about it, and I would say at this time, in a way, people were coming to experience the Christ. And this, and that ritual was in the form of communion. But nevertheless, people were coming to experience a sense of unity, a sense of oneness, to be in the presence of the Christ. And after that, after the communion, as part of the dismissal, as part of when people who had come in from the world, they had come into this sacred geometry of the cathedral. Our daughter just came back from France, and she was taking pictures of some of the cathedrals when she was over there. And the architecture is just overwhelming. It just, you just stand there, there's a sense of awe. And some of these things were built in the 1400s, a sense of awe. The sacred geometry and the way the architects made everything work together. And there's just this, it evokes this feeling. And Campbell said that when he visited the caves in southern France, and he stood inside these caves where 40,000 years ago, other human beings stood and they had painted these depictions on the wall. He said he felt the same feeling. This sense of awe, this sense of sacred space, this sense of sacred geometry. So you get this picture of the people coming in from the world. They're withdrawing from the world for a short period of time, and they're coming into what they have designated the sacred place. And they have come to experience this thing that we call the Christ. And as they are being dismissed, as they are going back out into the world, now when I was a kid, everything was still in Latin, the priest would offer a blessing. And in Latin it was Pax Domine, sit semper vobiscum. And the response of the altar boys on behalf of the people, and then later of the people themselves, was et cum spiritu tuo. And what that meant, more or less in English, is may the peace of the Lord always be with you. And then the response means, and with your spirit also. So as the people were going back into the world after having experienced this presence of the Christ, as they were going back into the world, they were being reminded, let this peace of the Lord, not the human understanding of peace, not the cessation of hostilities, but a different level of peace, a spiritual level of peace. Let this peace of the Lord be with you. And then the response is an acknowledgement that this is a spiritual idea, and with your spirit also. Not with your flesh, not with your blood, not with your body, but with your spirit, with your spirit. So if we think about that and this concept of how do we break out of this human cycle of war and peace and war and peace and war and peace, how do we do that? We have to let go of the human idea of what peace is. And we have to come into a spiritual idea of what peace is. We have to come into an understanding then of what this concept of the Christ would play, what this concept means to us as experience the presence of God within us means to us. And then we can understand the necessity for taking time to withdraw from the world into a sacred place of our own consciousness. to allow ourselves to come to experience this presence of the divine so that we can then go back out into the world and be that peace, be that peace. Remember Gandhi said, be the change you want to see in the world? We want to see peace in the world. We have to become the peace that we want to see. So the human concept of peace, the human experience is one of separation. It is one of division. It is one of differences. It is one of otherness. The intellect likes to analyze and divide. We show a human being something and they look at it, and as a Buddhist would tell us, is for the first nanosecond there is this unconditioned consciousness perceives. And then immediately after that, conditioned consciousness starts to take over and we start to analyze it. We start to look at it. What, is it like anything else I have ever seen before? Is it something that I would say is good, or is it something that I would say is bad, you know? Like the parable of the man who stepped on the rope at the water's edge and thought it was a snake. His first reaction was it was something bad, he'd getting out of there, and I can't blame him. I'd be moving too. But that's the analysis, you see, that's the intellect. And then the ego wants to struggle, it wants to survive, it wants to protect, and it wants to fight. And our human experience and our human history functions at those two levels. So our whole idea of peace is prevailing. We dominated somebody else. We got them, we beat them into submission. We took away their weapons. They can't hurt us anymore. We have peace. And it's only temporary at best. Because the peace isn't in our hearts. We are still thinking about the possibility of war. We still need to maintain armies because the next enemy might arise. So we're never truly at peace. We're just in an absence of war. And that's the human idea. And then the spiritual idea is this idea of unity and of harmony and of oneness. So when we think about this concept of what is the Christ, it is the presence of God within us. It is the point where the divine becomes human. And that is true of all of us. We didn't create these lives that we live. The bodies that started at conception didn't force God to create a soul, didn't force this consciousness. The life and the process that brought us into life is a spiritual process. It is a divine process. It is one of harmony. As we come to awaken, as we come into the consciousness where we start to awaken and embrace this idea that we are more than human beings who run around with sticks and clubs and rifles and bombs and beat each other into submission, as we start to come into this concept of our spiritual nature and our spirituality, then the question becomes, are we willing to accept it? Are we willing to embrace it? Are we willing to awaken to it? See, it's an invitation that is held out to us. It is always there. It will never go away. But it's an invitation that requires us to accept and then requires us to embrace. And what tends to happen is that in the process of awakening, we come to the concept that the presence of the divine, the omnipresence, is present where we are. It is present as we are. And since its nature is peace and harmony, and it can have no enemies, and there's no power that could stand against it, then we start to recognize that at some level within ourselves, this must be true as well. But we have to be willing to accept it. We have to be willing to do the spiritual practice that we've been talking about for a few weeks, to accept it. We have to be willing to step out of the world of day-to-day busyness and come into a sacred place. Sacred place of our heart. The sacred place where we can experience our oneness with the divine, and then we can go back out into the world. So if we look at the human experience, and we don't have to point fingers at anybody else, we can probably look at ourselves and see it in our own lives. As William James said, when people become adherents of a religion, not a whole lot in their life changes except they feel better about it. They feel better about it. And if we look at our concept of religion, we have, as human beings, over millennia, over recorded history, we have even used this idea of religion to justify war. Eric Idle of Monty Python group did a comedy skit one time, and he wrote a song, "My God is better than your God, bigger and stronger too," and it was about going off to war, crusades and holy wars and things such as that. And send our troops into war because God is on their side, and all of these different things that we have done. And we have to recognize that that is not a divine concept. That is a human concept of religion. And what we want is the spiritual concept of the experience of the peace and the presence of God. And we have to understand that that is not an intellectual exercise. That is not an idea. That is not a mathematical problem that we can sit down on a piece of paper and a pencil or a calculator or a computer and work it out. It is not something that the ego can strive and struggle and force us to experience. You can't force somebody to peace. Human history has taught us that. You can't force somebody into peace. On November 11th, 1918, people were forced to accept the terms. But in 20 years, they were back at it again. You can't force people to accept peace. They must become peaceful people. They must discover that peace within them, and we must discover that peace within us. So I think the first thing we have to do then is we have to recognize what is this thing that we're talking about when we're talking about peace. And it's not the absence of war. It is a spiritual experience of unity and of oneness and of safety and of protection. Because God is one, and God is omnipotence, and God can have no enemies. So as we come into that understanding, then, that this peace of the Lord, this peace that passes understanding, is not an intellectual or an egotistical experience, it is an experience of the heart. And then we have to ask ourselves, are we committed? Are we committed? Are we dedicated? Are we devoted to allowing that experience to come through us? And this is where the rubber meets the road, because it's one thing, every once in a while, once a year, to stop and say, let's celebrate the end of war. But once a year doesn't get it. We have history to tell us that once a year doesn't get it. This is something we must do daily. And it's not a struggle, you see. It's not something that we can go in and struggle and say, I'm going to go into my consciousness. I'm going to start right where I am because I can't do anything out there. I can't go into somebody else's head and change them. As much as we try to do that, we can't. We can't. But I can work with the only thing that's available to me, which is my own consciousness. And instead of going in and trying to struggle and fight and subdue and force any ideas of separation, any ideas of otherness, any ideas of enemies, any ideas of anything other than God's love, trying to struggle with it and go in and uproot it and toss it out. You can't do that. You can't do that, because when you are thinking about war, you're thinking about war. When you're thinking about struggle, you are thinking about struggle. If the room is dark, I cannot grab the darkness and throw it out. I have to turn on the light. I have to turn on the light. So what we want to do then in our dedication is to recognize that what I am doing is I am not going within my own consciousness to try to find everything that is unlike the peace of the Lord and throw it away. I can't do that. It won't work. It is impossible. But what I am doing is I am going into my own consciousness, into my own sacred place, into my own cathedral, to my own sacred geometry, to be still and to experience God's peace. To be still and to experience God's love. This is what spiritual practice is for. This is what spiritual growth is about. I was listening to something Joel Goldsmith was talking about. He said, when we are immature, when we see things, we try to judge them and analyze them and weigh them and what's wrong with them and all those things. And as we start to mature, we start to see the spiritual truth behind them. And this is what we want to do. We want to do our practice because that is what produces the growth. That is what produces the maturity. So we recognize that the peace that we're looking for is the peace that passes understanding, and the way to that peace is not the human way of struggle and fighting and tossing it out and all of those things, but it is a spiritual practice of finding within ourselves, staying within ourselves, staying with our practice until we experience that peace that passes understanding, until we experience the presence. Practicing the presence. Once we have that glimpse, now here's the other thing. People think, well, I do that. I said, I had the experience, and it was wonderful. And now I'm done. No, you're just beginning. You're just beginning. We have to stay with it. We have to continue our practice. We have to stay with it. Goldsmith was saying that they went back and they looked at different spiritual traditions for thousands of years, mystical traditions around the globe, and all of them typically said it took 9 years of practice, of dedicated practice, for the spiritual awakening to become more consistent than just little flashes in the pan, just little glimpses. Now the flashes in the pan and the glimpses are good. It's like a taste of honey. We know there's something good there and we want some more of it. But we have to be consistent in our practice. Consistent, committed, and dedicated. And as we as individuals, as we no longer dwell in the consciousness of division, in the consciousness of war, in the consciousness of anger and hatred and separation. We're no longer involved in that. We are now dwelling in the house of the Lord. Dwelling. Not just visiting, not just passing by and waving, but dwelling. He who dwells. 91st Psalm. He who dwells in the sacred place of the Almighty. No, he who dwells. I don't have it right. It'll come to me later. We must dwell in the consciousness of oneness. We must dwell in the consciousness of love. And as we dwell in that, everything unlike love diminishes in our lives. And unless and until we do that, we really can't look at another and expect them to do any different. And what I mean by that is so many times when we hear our politicians talk about peace, they're waiting for somebody else. Well, we can't stand down until they stand down. We can't do this until they do that. And they even make themselves into victims when they move into a warlike stance or warlike footing. Well, we had no choice but to go to war. We had no choice but to do that. We have a choice. You and I have a choice. We understand that the peace that we are seeking is not human peace. It is the peace that passes understanding. We understand that the way to it is not to struggle, but to do our spiritual practice consistently, committed to our spiritual practice, devoted to our spiritual practice until we experience the peace, and then to continue in that spiritual practice until our experience of the presence, the experience of the peace that passes understanding stays with us more and more and more. And as we do that, we are doing two things. Number one, we are no longer contributing to the problem. We are no longer contributing to the problem because we no longer believe in the necessity of war and hostility and of hatred and of separation. And we have, to some extent, cleaned up universal, race consciousness, I'm sorry, I was looking for the word, race consciousness. Carl Jung called it the collective unconscious. Dr. Holmes called it race consciousness. To some degree, we have cleaned up a part of race consciousness that believes in the necessity of war. And then as we go about our business, as we go through our daily lives, see, we emanate the peace. We emit it. It surrounds us. Have you ever been in the presence of someone and you just felt so peaceful? See, we become the change we wish to see in the world. We become the peace that passes understanding because we are dwelling in the presence of the divine. So if we wish to have the guns go silent forever, we can do something about that with our own self. The only thing we have to work with, our own consciousness. We can do something about that with our own self. We can recognize that it is a spiritual proposition. We can recognize that our spiritual practice is the tool that we use, that it is not a struggle, that it is not something to strive for, to work hard at, to squint your eyes down, but it is an entering into a sacred place of our own consciousness through our prayers, through our meditation, through our visualization, through our affirmations, through our education, through our reading, through our studying, through exposing ourselves to inspirational ideas and inspirational talks and inspirational people. It is the time that we take to go be in nature and just be still. It is the gratitude that we experience when we find God being God everywhere present. It is something that we can do every minute that we are awake, and if we will take the time to learn how, we can do every minute while we are asleep. But the key is consistency. The key is being committed. The key is recognizing that we each have a responsibility, a sacred duty, not just the soldiers who go off to war, but each and every one of us has a responsibility and a sacred duty to do our part to end war. But first, we must end it in our own hearts, in our own consciousness, in our immediate surroundings. I can't remember the exact quote, but it's something like, we have enough people in the world who are trying to give away something they don't have. We don't need any more of them. We need people who will go and find the peace and then have something to give from that sacred place within. And I believe that we are all trying to do that. I believe that we are all sincerely and earnestly trying to do that, or we wouldn't even be here together today. What I'm asking is, can we take it up a notch? Can we step it up? Can we look at our consistency? Can we look at our commitment? Can we look at the way we react to the world around us? And ask ourselves if there isn't just a little bit more we can be doing. Thank you for your service. And so it is.